corpses, but from the reader's realization that the narrator is aggressively arguing his case, and that given a last opportunity to humanize the self through a confrontation with death, he still flees in its face. The horror takes on more gruesome overtones if we read the story as John Harmer McCrory suggests. That is, the narrator's purpose in telling the tale is to mock the events, see humor in his own sadism, and finally, and I quote, to get the reader to identify with another in literature with him, but then horror and humor have always stood close to one another in literature. Indeed, many find The Black Cat difficult to read without laughing. However, after committing his first crime, the first black cat, before cutting out Pluto's eye, the narrator experiences a sentiment half of horror, half of remorse. Following the hanging of that same cat and seeing a relief of its figure appear on the wall of the recently destroyed house, he feels wonder and terror. Having disposed of the first pet, the narrator replaces Pluto with a similar cat who only elevates his level of fear to what he calls dread. Not exactly a dread of physical evil, and yet I should be at a loss of how otherwise to define it. As you can see, the progression of emotion from horror to terror to dread, each more indescribable than the previous, nicely captures the speaker's descent into the valley of existentialist despair. Although he believes that he can simply replace the previous cat that had served as an objectification of his fears, the narrator begins to encounter the unexplicable and more harrowing condition of dread. He confesses this fear is worse than the earlier emotion, because the terror and horror with which the animal inspired me have been heightened by the mark of white hair on its breast. After killing, in the second crime, his wife, the narrator chooses the path of obfuscation. So it's different. There is a clear change between the first crime and the second crime. Convincing himself that he has solved life's mysteries and his own difficulties through violent action. After that moment, the speaker tells us he slept soundly and tranquilly, for he believed the cat or the monster, and I quote, in terror had fled the premises forever. I should behold it no more. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dark deed disturbed me but little. The glee at my heart was too strong to be restrained. End quote. The progression here of feelings from tranquility to happiness to glee directly reverses the earlier descent and suggests our speaker has not really left behind his encounters with dread, despite his optimistic assertions to the contrary. It seems, in fact, that he's merely mimicking his early response with a hollow self-reassurance that all is well, nothing happened. Indeed, within minutes, he will be taping a cane against the artificial crypt that conceals his wife, because the individual plagued by anxiety mistakenly associates the anxious feelings with a specific object. He believes he can read the affliction by extinguishing the object. The horror heightens when the object is eliminated and the anxiety returns. Far from dissipating the emotional effect, the structure of Poe's tale heightens the uncanny effect on the reader. In retelling his tale for a captive audience, the narrator possesses the opportunity and capability to receive penance for his death. But actually, the narrator is not the primary point of The Black Cat, even if he has led us to believe that from the start. Instead, this is a tale that uses its tools to force a response from the reader and then asks him to consider the emotion it engenders. Unlike the strategy in The Fall of the House of Usher, where the narrator functions, in Darrell Abbas' words, as a mere point of view for the reader to occupy, the speaker in The Black Cat controls and distorts the point of view, leaving little room for the reader to pursue alternate directions. The trapped reader finally must face himself in the same way as the imprisoned and condemned narrator. In many ways, the final paragraph of The Black Cat illustrates how well the tale forces the burden of responsibility upon the reader. In the culmination of his story, the narrator explains how the police tore away at the basement wall and how the corpse of his murdered wife stood erect behind it, with the ghastly cat sitting on a head. So the cat was on his wife's head. The animal had survived behind it, with the ghastly survived by feeding from the body of his wife. Indeed, that metaphor of an unknown and unseen terror symbolizes perfectly the problematic nature of anxiety. Poe's narrator that ends with a simple explanation, and I quote, "I had walled the monster up within the tomb." And then, how could I have been so stupid? So that line follows one of the tale's more tortured puns, when the narrator describes the walls falling bodily as the corpse itself appears. Why doesn't he then go on to explain the reaction of the police and their subsequent arrest of him? What happens to the narrator upon completion of his tale? Why doesn't Poe complete the framing device with the narrator returning us to his jail and mulling over his thoughts? These questions emphasize how the tale insistently turns over responsibility for making sense of the events to the reader. The story is finally a conduit through which the reader must discover and confront his own emotions and fears. In many ways, the tale brings us to the same positions in which our narrator found himself right before his own life began to fall apart, facing an unknown fear and trying to overcome it. The challenge, to sum up, for all readers is to make the right choice when encountering that fear. Because Poe, as Punter says, leads us to doubt the narrator's veracity and competence in order to create that ambiguity always in the service of disturbing our assumption of the real. So, thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, just ask me.